When a president publicly declares that the territory of an ally is his own concern, the world crosses a dangerous threshold where the rules can no longer be assumed to be respected. Greenland, a frozen island once thought remote and irrelevant, is becoming a litmus test for the entire post-World War II international order. What's being threatened isn't just sovereignty, it's trust. Trust in allies, in NATO, and in the very concept of the West. If you care about geopolitics not through slogans, but through the actual logic of power that drives it, subscribe to this channel and join us in unpacking this story. No explosions echoed across the Arctic skies. No warships entered the icy waters. No declaration of war was read before Congress or the United Nations. The Greenland Crisis began with what seemed like the lightest element in international politics: words. But those very words, when spoken by a superpower, carried enough weight to shake a global order that has lasted nearly 8 decades. When the President of the United States publicly declared that Greenland is vital to U.S. national security and that Washington would one way or another ensure control over the island, the world immediately understood. This was no longer a campaign soundbite or a media provocation. It was a message of power, one sent not only to Copenhagen or Nuuk, but to the entire U.S. alliance system. In that moment, Greenland ceased to be a distant icy landmass on a map. It became a test of the very idea of a post-World War II international order. Greenland is an autonomous territory under the Kingdom of Denmark. It lies within NATO's security space. It is home to tens of thousands of people whose right to self-determination is recognized under international law. And for the first time in decades, a Western power is no longer hiding its intention to impose its will on the territory of an ally. Not through closed-door negotiations, not with the gentle language of diplomacy, but with blunt words that border on an ultimatum. The shock lies not just in what was said, but in the chilling familiarity of how it sounded. What the world once condemned when Russia spoke of Ukraine, or China of Taiwan, now seems to echo from another center of power. Europe is shaken not because it doesn't grasp Greenland's strategic value, but because it realizes something deeper. The moral boundary that once separated the defenders of order from the disruptors of order is rapidly blurring. NATO is not confused due to a lack of military tools, but because it lacks the language to name a scenario it was never prepared for. What happens when the threat comes from within the alliance itself? And it is at this point that the Greenland story moves beyond the realm of territorial disputes or strategic disagreements. It forces the world to confront a long-avoided question. Does the political West, with its rules, its promises, its spirit of alliance, still exist as a unified entity? Or has it always been just a thin veneer, ready to crack the moment the core interests of the powerful are put on the line? To understand why a single statement could cause such a seismic shift, we must dig deeper into the logic behind it. Not the logic of diplomacy, but the logic of power. Not the language of partnership, but the language of those who believe they have the right to decide. And it is from that very moment, when a superpower begins to speak in that voice, that the world enters a far more dangerous phase than anything visible on the surface. For decades after World War II, the West built for itself a clear and consistent moral narrative. Power, no matter how great, must operate within the bounds of law. Military strength was not to be used arbitrarily, especially not against allies. The U.S. might lead, but it was not to command. That very narrative created the distinction between a rules-based order and a world of brute force, where the strong impose their will on the weak without justification. But what's happening around Greenland shows that this narrative is fracturing from within. When Washington declares that the island is vital to U.S. national security and hints that control over it is non-negotiable, the language has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer the familiar language of dialogue between allies, where interests are weighed and compromises made. It's the language of raw power, where the only priority is the need of the strong, and the will of the other side becomes secondary, even disposable. This was a turning point, not because Greenland suddenly became more important, but because of how America spoke about it. When Denmark's former foreign minister bluntly compared Washington's behavior to what the world has witnessed in Ukraine or Taiwan, it wasn't a provocative analogy meant to grab headlines. It was a cold recognition of a recurring logic. I am stronger. I need this for my security. Therefore, your will is not a decisive factor. No matter how it's worded, the core of that argument remains disturbingly familiar. What worries many allies is not just the content of the demand, but the precedent it sets. If a Western power can openly treat an ally's territory as an internal security matter of its own, then the moral boundary that once separated order keepers from order breakers begins to lose meaning. In such a world, criticism aimed at other great powers loses its force, because the very country once seen as the guardian of rules is now willing to step outside them when it sees fit. At a deeper level, this reflects a shift in mindset. In a world of intensifying global competition, the concept of ally no longer seems bound by moral obligation, but filtered through a lens of utility. Those who deliver strategic value are kept close. Those who pose obstacles may face pressure. The patience of diplomacy gives way to the impatience of power, and the belief that strength can swiftly solve complex problems returns as a familiar imperial illusion. That's why Greenland is more than just a story about a frozen island. It is a mirror reflecting how a superpower views the world when it feels cornered, challenged, and no longer trusts that the rules are strong enough to protect its interests. As insecurity rises, the language shifts, becoming harder, more direct, and less concerned with how others perceive it. This is the moment when force begins to speak in place of reasoning. And yet, here a deep paradox is revealed. If the US truly faced a security shortfall in Greenland, then such a demand might be seen as a compensatory move. But the facts raise an unavoidable question. Washington has maintained a military presence in Greenland for decades, with broad authority rare even among allied relationships. If America already has nearly everything it could want in military terms, what makes it still feel that it's not enough? Could it be that the core issue isn't security, but a desire for absolute control that extends beyond what the rules allow? That question leads us into the next layer of the Greenland story, where a treaty once thought to have resolved all concerns may in fact reveal a deeper ambition. If we set aside all political emotions and view the Greenland story through a purely legal lens, a puzzling paradox emerges. Because on paper, the US hasn't been sidelined, quite the opposite. Washington has secured some of the broadest security privileges ever granted to a major power on the territory of an allied nation during peacetime. The 1951 Greenland Defense Agreement, signed at the height of the Cold War, laid the foundation for America's long-term military presence in the Arctic. And for over 70 years, that agreement has never been rolled back to Washington's disadvantage. According to the treaty and its later amendments, especially the 2004 agreement, the U.S. is allowed to establish military bases, deploy forces, expand infrastructure, and equip installations as needed to meet its own strategic objectives. In situations deemed necessary by Washington, they are only required to give notification, not to seek permission. There are virtually no legal barriers forcing the U.S. to wait for step-by-step approval from Copenhagen or Greenland's autonomous government. In reality, Greenland has long been part of America's defense space, from Cold War-era early warning radar systems to today's advanced surveillance infrastructure, which is why, when Washington declares that Greenland is not adequately protected or that the U.S. must ensure control, the question arises immediately. Ensure what? When militarily, they already possess nearly everything a strategist could dream of. No bases have been shut down. No treaties have been revoked. There's been no refusal of cooperation from Denmark or Greenland. The gap Washington refers to doesn't seem to lie on the military map, but at a deeper level of power. The difference lies in the fragile line between presence and possession. A military base, no matter how large, still exists within the sovereignty of the host nation. It requires respect for appearances, restraint in language, and an implicit acknowledgement that the stronger party's power is not absolute. Total political control, on the other hand, eliminates those constraints. When a territory no longer belongs to a sovereign ally, there's no longer an obligation to listen, no need to explain, and no limits except the will of the one in control. At this point, the 1951 treaty becomes something of a double-edged sword. It reveals that Washington's problem isn't a lack of access, but a lack of the feeling of absolute control. In an increasingly unstable world where great power rivalry is returning, even partial dependence on someone else's decisions, even an ally's, starts to be seen as a risk. And when that anxiety outweighs legal thinking, the ambition to go beyond existing agreements becomes more understandable, though not necessarily more legitimate. Yet here, one crucial element is often overlooked in the cold logic of strategic analysis. Greenland is not a blank space on the map, a place for powers to redraw borders based on their security needs. Behind the treaties, the bases, and the military calculations is a real society, with real people, real memories, and life or death choices of their own. When the story is reduced to control and strategic interest, the first thing to disappear from view is the voice of those who actually live on that land. And that is the most dangerous blind spot in the entire Greenland debate, because no form of power can endure if it's built on the assumption that people are just a secondary factor to be brushed aside. In most strategic discussions about Greenland, its people tend to appear a footnote, faint, peripheral, and easily forgotten. Maps are laid out, shipping lanes redrawn, radars and mineral reserves weighed, but the lives of those who actually inhabit the island rarely take center stage. This absence creates a dangerous illusion that Greenland is an empty land, a geopolitical void waiting to be filled by the will of the powerful. The reality is entirely different. Greenland has a society, a history, a collective memory, and life or death choices shaped across generations. For most of its people, the concept of security isn't tied to military doctrines or great power rivalries. It's about everyday essentials: access to healthcare, free education for their children, social welfare in a harsh environment, and the right to live in rhythm with their indigenous culture. These values aren't political slogans. They are the bedrock of survival in a land where nature constantly pushes humans to the edge. So when Greenlanders say they wish to remain connected to Denmark and Europe, it's not a geopolitical stance meant to oppose someone. It is the choice of a small society that prioritizes stability, welfare, and legal protection over promises of rapid growth riddled with risk. In the Nordic model, they see a familiar system, one that places community welfare above short-term extractive gains. And it's that very familiarity that creates a sense of safety no vague strategic commitment could ever replace. The contrast becomes even starker when Greenlanders look to other Arctic examples, especially Alaska. There, resources are exploited at scale, but indigenous communities are often pushed aside, grappling with environmental pollution, high living costs, and cultural erosion. That image isn't a theoretical warning. It's a lived lesson in the cost of defining land solely by its economic and strategic value, rather than by the people who call it home. That's why viewing Greenland as a strategic asset to be controlled is not just a legal or diplomatic issue, it's a denial of a community's political existence. When the voices of the people are excluded from the analysis, every argument about security becomes distorted. No order can rightfully claim legitimacy if it's built on the assumption that the self-determination of smaller communities can be sacrificed for the interests of the more powerful. And yet, in distant centers of power, Greenland is still so often spoken of in a different language, the language of resources. Rare earths, strategic minerals, potential oil reserves, the numbers stack up as though they could tell the story on their own. In that narrative, people once again vanish, replaced by resource estimates and exploitation maps. And it's precisely at the intersection of this urge for control and the illusion of untold wealth that the Greenland story enters a different layer, where resource nationalism promises much, but history has shown time and again that such promises often leave behind more scars than prosperity. In the imagination of many centers of power, Greenland appears as a frozen treasure chest. Rare earth, strategic minerals, oil reserves, accompanied by glowing forecasts and the promise that, as climate change melts the ice, these riches will become viable. Brightly colored maps, optimistic resource reports, and buzzwords like supply chain security and resource independence make the narrative sound both urgent and reasonable. But here, an old illusion of history reemerges, the belief that resources, once controlled, will automatically translate into power and prosperity. Greenland's reality is far harsher. Its infrastructure is almost non-existent by modern industrial standards. Every road, port, and power line must be built under extreme weather conditions, at costs several times higher than in temperate regions. The extraction season is tightly constrained by the long Arctic winter, where freezing temperatures and heavy snow can collapse the most meticulous logistics overnight. Even when modern technology helps overcome some of these challenges, the economics remain fragile, tied to global market prices and dependent on sustained political subsidies. More importantly, Greenland's resource story cannot be separated from its environmental and social costs. Large-scale extraction in a fragile ecosystem carries the risk of irreversible pollution. When land is poisoned, when water sources are compromised, it is the indigenous communities who must live with the consequences the longest. History has shown time and again a bitter pattern. Profits often leave quickly, while the damage remains, deeply rooted in the lives of those who had no voice in the strategic boardrooms. Resource nationalism, then, isn't just an economic perspective, it is a lens of power. It turns territory into a container, people into secondary variables, and the future into a short-term calculation. Through this lens, controlling Greenland seems logical, perhaps even necessary. But it's this very simplification that conceals a troubling truth. Resources do not automatically produce security. More often, they attract competition, instability, and increasingly deeper military commitments to protect massive investments. And when resources are placed at the heart of security, the political logic begins to shift. Allies are no longer seen as equal partners, but as holders of a strategic vault. Pressure builds, language hardens, and the line between persuasion and coercion begins to blur. From here, the story is no longer just about Greenland or its minerals. It expands into a broader space, the structure of alliances, the level of trust between nations, and the true meaning of collective defense commitments. Because if resource interests can lead a great power to question the sovereignty of an ally, what happens when those interests collide directly with the core principles of a military alliance? When power and profit begin to overshadow rules and commitments, an unavoidable question begins to surface, though few dare to say it aloud. In an extreme scenario, will mutual defense guarantees still hold? And it is from that very doubt that the Greenland Crisis enters its most dangerous phase, where NATO and Article 5 are no longer abstract concepts, but a test of life and death trust in the entire security order. For over 70 years, NATO has been more than a military alliance. It has been a political promise, repeated so often that it became a given. Article 5, the core clause of the treaty, rests on a simple yet powerful assumption. If one member is attacked, all will treat it as an attack on themselves. It is that near absolute certainty, not the frequency of its invocation, that created deterrence, preventing wars rather than triggering them. People trusted Article 5 not because it had been used many times, but because no one doubted it would be honored when the time came. Yet the Greenland Crisis has planted a seed of unease in that space, not through tanks or missiles, but through a quiet, unsettling, and dangerous question. What happens when the threat doesn't come from outside the alliance, but from one of its core members? This is a question NATO was never designed to answer. The entire architecture of the alliance assumes that the United States is the protector, the ultimate source of strength, not a destabilizing variable that must be restrained. When Washington began using coercive language with an ally over Greenland, even in the absence of military action, the psychological impact rippled across Europe. In European capitals, officials began quietly asking, though no one dared say it aloud, if America's definition of security can be determined unilaterally, what boundaries protect smaller allies from similar pressure? And if one day those interests directly conflict with a member state's sovereignty, will the collective mechanisms be strong enough to protect the weaker party? What's truly frightening is that Article 5 isn't just a legal clause, it is a collective belief. It functions because of the certainty that members, especially the leading power, will act within the framework of shared values. When that belief begins to erode, even if the treaty remains intact on paper, its deterrent power fades. An alliance in which members start gaming out what-if scenarios will react more slowly, more cautiously, and be more vulnerable to division in times of crisis. That's why the real debate isn't whether Article 5 would be triggered in a Greenland scenario. It's whether it still holds the same moral weight. If a great power can pressure an ally using its own security logic, then the concept of collective defense becomes fragile. It no longer looks like a mutual commitment among equals, but risks devolving into an asymmetrical relationship where one side determines the safety of all others. At a deeper level, this moment exposes Europe's long-standing dependency. For decades, the continent entrusted its security to the US in exchange for stability and space to focus on economics and social welfare. That delegation worked as long as interests and values moved in tandem. But when interests begin to diverge from values, that dependence becomes a strategic vulnerability. Greenland merely makes that contradiction visible because it places the issue of Allied sovereignty directly on the table. It's no coincidence that NATO's response to the Greenland crisis has been hesitant and restrained. The alliance doesn't lack military power, but it lacks a political playbook for a scenario in which its cornerstone becomes the source of instability. Every statement is carefully measured, every move symbolic, because any escalation risks exposing what no one wants to admit. NATO has never prepared to defend itself from its own internal contradictions. And yet it is precisely this unease that sets a quiet shift in motion. When the unspoken questions start surfacing in closed-door meetings, a new awareness begins to take root. Europe is realizing it can no longer rely on the assumption that all commitments will always be honored automatically. Trust, to survive, must be reinforced with independent capability and political will. And from the moment Article 5 is no longer seen as an absolute certainty, a slow but irreversible awakening begins on the far side of the Atlantic. Europe's awakening did not arrive with a grand declaration or a loudly announced strategy. It came quietly, slowly, with the belated realization that something once taken for granted could no longer be assumed. Greenland wasn't the first shock, but it was the one that made it impossible for many European capitals to keep pretending that things would simply settle back into place. When the language of power replaces the language of commitment, the long-standing sense of security begins to crack. Europe's actions in Greenland, though modest in military terms, carry deep political meaning. The deployment of symbolic forces wasn't meant to provoke, and certainly not to confront a longtime ally. It was Europe's way of telling itself that it can no longer remain on the sidelines when the sovereignty of a part of its shared security space is called into question. In a world of signals, sometimes a small move speaks louder than a long speech. The biggest shift is happening at the level of mindset. For years, Europe has grown accustomed to being a beneficiary of security, relying on the US umbrella while it focused on building its social model. That model was successful, but it also created a dangerous habit, the habit of postponing hard questions. Greenland is forcing Europe to ask those questions again, not as distant hypotheticals, but in a real-world scenario where strategic interests and allied values no longer align so smoothly. Awakening, therefore, doesn't mean turning away from America. It means recognizing that a sustainable alliance cannot be built on blind trust alone. It must be backed by the capacity for autonomy. Debates about joint defense, burden sharing, and Europe's independent ability to act have been delayed or diluted for years. Now they return with a different tone, no longer as a luxury, but as a matter of survival, to protect Europe's own voice within an alliance it helped build. The sense of belatedness comes from the awareness that time was wasted. Had this reckoning begun earlier, perhaps Europe wouldn't have been caught so flat-footed in the face of the Greenland crisis. But history rarely offers do-overs. What remains is the ability to learn from the shock and to turn it into momentum. Beneath the caution of official statements and the calculations behind every step, one truth is now clearer than ever. Europe no longer sees security guarantees as a permanent gift. And in that quiet shift, Greenland becomes more than a crisis. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the limits of dependency and a reminder that international order doesn't endure by inertia. It survives through choices made at the right time. For Europe, that moment of choice may have come late, but at the very least, this time it did not look away. Greenland is not the destination of a singular ambition, but a flashpoint where many of the world order's fault lines emerge all at once. It didn't begin with gunfire, but it marked the end of a long-standing illusion that the post-World War II order was strong enough to shield itself from tremors coming from within its own pillars. When power starts to speak louder than rules, when interests are placed above commitments, foundations once thought immovable suddenly feel alarmingly fragile. In the story of Greenland, we don't just see a frozen island spoken of in the language of security. We see a subtle shift in how the world now operates. Allies can become bargaining chips. Sovereignty can be redefined through vague terms like vital importance. And values once considered untouchable can be pushed aside when they stand in the way of strategic calculus. This isn't a sudden collapse, it's a slow erosion, where each small precedent paves the way for bolder steps ahead. Yet Greenland's significance isn't solely ominous. It is a moment that forces nations, especially in Europe, to face the hard truth. The international order cannot be maintained through habit or inertia. Trust must be rebuilt, commitments must be clarified, and security can no longer be outsourced unconditionally. In the initial hesitation and cautious responses, a process of reshaping has already begun. Slow, difficult, but inevitable. At a deeper level, Greenland raises a question about how we define security in the 21st century. Security isn't just about military bases or shipping lanes. It's also about the stability of communities, the self-determination of small societies, and the ability to restrain power within moral limits. When those elements are ignored, security achieved through force always carries the seed of long-term instability. And history has shown time and again that the price of that instability is rarely paid first by the powerful. That's why the final question Greenland leaves us with isn't who it belongs to or how many resources can be controlled. The real question is, what kind of world order are we willing to live in after Greenland? An order where laws still carry weight, or one where everything can be renegotiated under the pressure of might. That choice doesn't rest solely in the hands of great powers, but in the responses of smaller nations, of alliances, and of the global public itself. If you have your own perspective on the Greenland crisis and what it signals for the future of world order, share it in the comments below. And if you'd like to keep unpacking the quiet moves shaping 21st century geopolitics, don't forget to subscribe for more slow, deep, and thoughtful analysis.